500 میگابایت اینترنت کاملا رایگان دریافت میشه.
سلام علیکم. همه یک سلام اطلاعی بر شما رو برای دیدگی رای ارسال میکنید. کمپانی سامسونگ یک تلویزیون LCD را به شما به عنوان یک مشات تحفه میده و همچنان ستاره‌ای که مقام اطلاعی را از آن خود میکنند. یک موتر کاغذپیش کمپانی انرژی درینک بیگ بیا به شما میده.
This program is a look at the enormous changes which have come to Japan in just the last 15 years.
Yes, that was the beginning of the film that we made as part of our installation, which is composed of a film, objects, pictures, and text. So Tahl will present now the theory and history of this project. And this film was born from the research. So first we had discussion about what it means, the shock of modernity, and following the history of certain aspects of it. And then from this discussion, we took out certain elements and made this jump of translation from the text and theory to the film.
We opened in the preview.
But you had a slideshow option. Yeah. If you want to slide the slideshow, there was a slideshow option.
It's okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Where shall we start? We should start perhaps here. Let me read to you this quote from Marshall Berman. It's a bit small, so I'll read it out to you. I actually find it here. There is a mode of vital experience of space and time, of the self and others, of life's possibilities and perils, that is shared by men and women all over the world today. I will call this body of experience modernity. To be modern is to find ourselves in an environment that promises us adventure, power, joy, growth, transformation of ourselves and the world, and at the same time that threatens to destroy everything we have, everything we know, everything we are. Modern environments and experiences cut across all boundaries of geography and ethnicity, of class and nationality, of religion and ideology. In this sense, modernity can be said to unite all mankind. Which I think is a good point of departure, as we'll see. This project is driven, if you like, by a thesis, to try and put it crudely, said that a lot of the conflicts, global conflicts today, are generated by the entry of modernity into new territories, into areas of traditional society, upsetting traditional hierarchies, upsetting local economies and these kinds of things. These conflicts tend to be framed in all kinds of ways by our media, and we're trying to kind of generate a different kind of discussion of these conflicts and looking at some of the actual forces which generate it, instead of falling into the traps of how the media tends to frame them. But I have to start with a little explanation, perhaps, or presentation about modernity itself. And what we mean by modernity, because modernity is a big concept, right? The easiest way to think about it is modernization. That's really about technological advancement. That's only part of what modernity is. It's about new technology changing the world. It's also about masses, about the kind of migration from countryside to cities, about the changes in social structure and things. And we can categorize modernity in different ways. Let's look at a few of them. One main issue is time. In traditional society, and again, traditional society is a term in sociology. You can find Max Weber, in Habermas, and so on. In traditional society, time is typically seen as cyclical, connected to agrarian calendar, or as static, as opposed to modernity, in which time is understood as linear. You have the issue of political economy, which is, of course, we're referring to the rise of capitalism. In Europe, if we look to the marketplace in the feudal town, it was relatively small before actually, by Renaissance Italy and so on, becoming trade becoming the manufacturing, and with it you see of course a rise of a new class, the urban burghers, which become the bourgeoisie. And one of the features which matter here about capitalism is its need for growth. When we talk about growth, typically we talk a lot about productivity, but it's also about new markets and expansion of existing markets. And as a result of that, of course, this leads to conquests, to empire, to colonialism, all this kind of search for new markets. And with this search for new markets, also a kind of exporting of modernity beyond Europe, where it starts off. When we talk about social structure and the entry of modernity, on the one hand, can you hear me in the back?
Only just.
Okay. So when we're talking about modernity in the sense of, turn it on, I suppose. Turn it on. When we're talking about modernity in traditional society, or sorry, about social structure, we're talking about fixed structures, we're talking about big family units, we're talking about the production unit, the economic production unit being usually the family unit, the patriarch being the head of the family and the head of the production unit. We're talking about modernity, we're talking about new social relations, the urban landlord, the manager in the factory, the owner of the factory. We've got the smaller family unit, the fact that the father and perhaps mother both go and work for someone else. So we've got new social structures. And of course, when we're talking about thought, ideology, and politics, and we're talking about the emergence of reason. If in traditional society, let's say power was justified or seen as a natural phenomenon, the king, the priest, had power because of God or because it's a kind of natural condition. What we get, of course, with modernity is a need to justify this via reason. Reason first raises the questions, the asking of why, and then demand this kind of justification. So also this tends to upset, of course, traditional structures of hierarchy within societies. So that's just a kind of short, a little bit about what we are talking about when we mean modernity. Now, one of the things we want to argue here, that there is a geography to what we are talking about. Because if modernity itself was assembled and created, let's say, in Europe, then when it started getting exported, it was also often seen as a European thing. And the geography matters, because what happens is that while the forces that operate are similar across the globe, if you like, the way they are applied, the way they get received, change according to the specific context. And this context depends also on the distance from Europe, on how Europe is perceived from these contexts. So just to quickly go through a few examples which can maybe give you a bit of an idea of what we are talking about. If we're talking about the Jewish population in Europe, this is a condition of within modernity. If you have in the 18th century, during Enlightenment, new ideas changing European society, you have those enclaves of what had been persecuted and excluded minority. And suddenly they get a kind of extended hand, an offer to join society. And what this creates is quite unique. You get a kind of rupture between secular Jews and religious Orthodox Jews. In a sense, much more radical than in similar ruptures happening in Christianity, Islam, and other religions. And that has to do a lot with the condition of European Jews, specifically within a changing society around them. On the left here we have an image of Moses Mendelssohn, who was a Jew who started his own Enlightenment movement, if you like, the Haskalah. And he was a philosopher in Prussia, in Germany, and he was a kind of between both worlds of the Jewish ghetto and the Enlightenment philosophers. And if we're talking about the fight against these changes, of course we get the recreation of the ghetto, the building of the walls by those who didn't want to change, who didn't want to be assimilated, if you like, into the changing European society. If we step a bit further away, we go to Turkey. We see it's a condition in which, if you think of the Ottoman Empire and the kind of centuries of a kind of adversity with Europe, but also trade with Europe, being near Europe, but perhaps outside Europe, in which the changes happening in Europe were very visible, if you like, the Ottomans, and the condition where maybe earlier on, culture, economy, everything seemed to happen in the Ottoman Empire, but by the 19th century there was an impression within the Ottoman Empire that they are being left behind. So you get the period of the Tanzimat, early attempts to kind of insert a new type of bureaucratic structure, emulating the one in European societies. But more importantly, after the demise of the Ottoman Empire, you get, of course, Ataturk and his attempt to reconstruct Turkey as a modern nation state. So the idea of a homogeneous people, a modern nation state, it's about literacy, a new alphabet, women going out to work and these kind of things. A lot of it done, of course, by decree. And in the case of the modern Turkish Republic, you have, at the time of Atatürk, these strong enclaves within the cities of modern society, if you like, clerks, bureaucrats from the apparatus left behind by the Ottoman Empire, traders and so on, and you have a much more agricultural hinterland, and of course a kind of conflict emerging from this. Now geographically, let's step a bit further to Japan, and maybe this idea of the shop becomes clearest in Japan because of the moment in the 19th century we have a Black Fleet, American ships, enter Tokyo Bay and issue an ultimatum to what is a feudal society. Either you're open to trading or we invade you. And then comes a period of the opening of Japan to trade. You have a period in which you get what's called the restoration of the Meiji Empire. And with the restoration comes a period of rapid modernization. So a very, very fast and kind of brutal, you can say, movement towards modernity here. And I think also anyone can still find in Japan still a lot of that, let's call it the high art that emerged out of folk art, the kind of high art of Japanese culture, side by side with what we might call trash culture that comes out of commodified culture of today, really sitting side by side. So just kind of fast, crude overview of things to give you an idea of what we want to talk about here. And conflict today, well again, we're talking a lot about the formation of modern nation states out of conditions, for example, of empire. So how do you forge this when people used to move around before? We're talking about religion once being a force which permeated all aspects of life, and in a modern society has its own place as a private aspect. We're talking about the breakup of the extended family, I mentioned that already. And we're talking about the idea of social mobility, again an ideal, not always a practice, it's not always really there, but again in traditional society things are fixed. The son of a blacksmith usually becomes a blacksmith. In a modern society there's at least a promise of social mobility, the idea that you can move up in social rank. And you've got of course what happens as a result of capitalism entering other types of markets. And lastly, the creation of new identities. Of course, this kind of conflict is a classic, but I want to point out here that what typically happens is that the forces, or those groups which present themselves as defenders of the tradition, are not necessarily with traditional society. What we call traditions is an invention of modernity. Traditional society had customs. And a lot of the groups, I mean, if you want to think in art terms, we can think of the Romantics in the 19th century, who of course rejected industrial society and technology and looked back to medieval times, but themselves were part of the change, were part of modernity, because they also looked back in time and established this idea of linear time against the classical time. So here too, of course, when we talk about Al-Qaeda, for example, and the cultivation of this kind of image, we're talking already about a modern movement, even if it poses as something else completely. And just to mention in passing, this is interesting, I don't know if any of you have seen a documentary about this TV series in Afghanistan called Afghan Idol. You saw a little bit of it in the video clip before, Afghan Star, sorry. So it's kind of based on the model of American Idol, pop singers and kind of voting of the audience. And of course in the documentary you get the producers, local Afghan producers, who are actually part of a bigger company which is American. And one of the things they talk of course about how this is about democracy, how it's about the new Afghan state, and these kind of things. And usually we take these kind of things as just producers over talking and so on. But it's interesting in the case of Afghanistan, with its history, with the kind of difficulty to establish it as a kind of modern sense nation state and idea of homogeneity, that here you have in this program the different ideas of consumer society, a kind of idea of egalitarian, and a kind of belief that the people voting will do not by, let's say, ethnic background of the participants, but by merit. So all of these kind of ideas are here, whether it works or not. And I think with that little, fast overview, I wanted to move on to the next stage. So, yeah, say something, or should we just...
Yeah, we're going to show you now the rest of the film. It's about 5 minutes more. Just want to say that there was some challenge here in translating the theory and history in our discussions. There was a challenge in translating between text and image. to use artistic audiovisual language to transfer and to express ideas that were inherent in the text and in the ideas that we wanted to deliver. Also, this process, is going, since the 19th century, even 18th, and audiovisual, film and video is 20th century, material. So, what you're going to see here now is the rest of the film, which is a kind of a composition, audiovisual, we call it experimental, mainstream, factor, documentary work.
Changes in economy, in the system of government, in the Japanese outlook on life, changes which have produced an external prosperity, but an inward turmoil. This is one of Tokyo's rock and roll cafes. There are thousands of them. Japanese youth go.
Can you hear the sound or?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Okay. Sorry.
For rock and roll in a big way, though always with Jimmy. The singer does not speak English. The Japanese version will have little in common with the American words, but the general effect is Western excitement.
Modern Turkey is a vigorous ally of the West. She welcomes not only foreign products, but the foreign bases and men on her soil to help defend her way of life and her NATO alliance. Not all of her problems have been solved, however. Her economy is heavily bolstered by, some say virtually dependent on, Western aid. Her democracy is still far from perfect, and historians still argue about Ataturk, the man who in less than 2 decades made Turkey over. His methods, his tyrannies, his personal habits. Yet none denies the staggering achievements of the incredible Turk.
Japanese youth finds enormous excitement in everything Western. They revel in their new freedom, which allows them to go where they wish, do what they wish, read what they want, discuss and adopt new ideas. They're rebels against the old way of life. Equally, they adopt the externals of Western society, and even some of its less popular usages. Their diet is changing. Japanese youth is growing taller and heavier than their parents.
To make a modern nation capable of government by the people, all Turkey must be sent to school. Islamic traditions are shattered. A man's image, Mustafa Kemal's, is displayed in public. He also orders all Turks to adopt Western-style family names and is himself christened Ataturk, meaning father of the Turks. The faces of Turkish girls and women are hidden, and they live in virtual slavery until Ataturk unveils them by decree. Now divorced from his wife, he takes pleasure in the company of emancipated women, and insists that all Turkish women adopt Western clothes, gives them equal rights under the law after abolishing polygamy, and opens to women all the trades and all the professions. From the United States comes Ambassador Joseph Clark Grew.
For this revolution and high accomplishment, one man is primarily responsible. The name of Gazi Mustafa Kemal will forever be associated with the development, founding of the new modern Turkish state.
to some nature credit card on the desk. Just local.
Yeah. This just, we're looking at obviously America's serving Russia there. That is the World Trade Center.
Okay, do you have any questions? Do we just want to go and have a beer?
Did the Taliban have a go at the guy in Afghanistan?
I wonder in your research, in your film, you have considered and to distinguish the difference between westernization and modernization. A lot of the images which are really interesting, maybe humorous in that extent, they're very much about westernization. Japanese society having cultures. I mean, the distinction between also that and modernization is so small, but modernization historically had to do with a lot of kind of social agenda, not adopting patterns of lifestyle only. I just wonder how you begin to deal.
We've actually, one of the things we discussed, there's a question here about image, actually. And what you talk about westernization is at the end of the day often depicted best by culture. And of course we want to talk about much modern culture. The second issue that is easy to visualize is the issue of modernization in the technological sense. So culture and the technological are more easy for us to visualize than some of the more important things we want to touch upon. So this is indeed an issue. I think that's why also for us the Afghanistan is interesting. It may be cultural, but beyond the kind of sometimes hollow promises of the producers, there's a question of this kind of model. You know, it goes beyond the cultural limitation, I think. But the question is raised is, can it really achieve this idea of meritocracy in a commercial TV program? Or is it really about expanding consumer society, actually? You know, what does it actually do as opposed to what it promises to do? What does it succeed in? So for us, that may be a cultural product which has that kind of impact which we are looking for, which is a bit more than just showing somebody in traditional clothes beside some kind of modern piece of technology or something like that, which is, you know, something we smile at but doesn't really show what we are talking about. So there's an issue, I think, for us also working with image, how to express some of the more important changes we are talking about rather than superficial changes. Especially if we see the important ones as the structural ones rather than the cultural ones.
I think we need to problematize a bit the notion of tradition, because also in your abstract representation you talk about how tradition and traditional societies are shocked by modernity, so to speak. But to a great extent, even the notion of tradition as something unfixed, rather something fixed and unchanging and stable, to a great extent is really an invention of modernity. Because modernity and its discourse of the need for a break, it had to have a tradition to break from, a father to kill, so to speak. And when we talk about other societies outside the West, the so-called West, that might have been shocked by tradition, we should keep in mind that the tradition that might have been shocked that we are talking about in the West pretending we are the West, is really the way of being defined by the West, what tradition is, because the so-called traditional societies in their fixed and eternal ways are never really that. I mean, so that societies always are changing and evolving, is that they were changing and evolving in ways different to the West. So
I would like to say, first of all, I mean, thanks. Of course, what I presented was very crude academically, right? But the traditional society, I mean, with this we're talking really about definitions, we transfer sociology from Max Weber to Habermas, and they use it not in order to say that it's less good than modern society, but actually as part of the critique of modern society, to try and pinpoint, both of them very famous critics of modern society, to pinpoint some of the issues, let's say, lacking or what is lost with modernity in Europe. So that's how they use it. Of course, it's a limited category because it's also very, very generalized. From the idea that the main political economy in traditional society is agriculture, which is not always the case. It sometimes is, sometimes isn't, to many other features. So yes, it is crude, but the sociologists who used it didn't use it as a way of critiquing traditional society, but as a way of critiquing modernity itself.
Yeah, but nevertheless, they still use it to an extent as a kind of essentialized notion. So even if their critique was directed towards modernity, even though with Habermas I'm not really sure, because he's a die-hard, supporter of enlightenment.
Exactly.
He's trying to rescue modernity, essentially. But even when they are being critical of modernity, their notion of what tradition is comes via modernity. So we need to be careful with that.
Totally, because especially Weber and Habermas were also looking at feudal society, European feudal society more than any other. So there's an issue with the generalization of these terms.
No, it's also just, I think I can also not think anymore, but I mean, what your film does, I mean, it sort of, makes a circle of sort of, on one end, I mean, modernity starts in the 16th century, if we sort of look at the term of modernity much more than we use it nowadays, modernity. And of course, it's always like what you also show, you started with the cars and the mixers, and that it's sort of this positive connotation about it, which we then in 20th centuries we used modernity, the term, but of course always with industrialization and labor and blah, 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 and that it's sort of these two, you have like so many different notions and regions which you all now put together in one plot, and that is kind of my question, just like what's your intention with sort of like, going from Japan to then September 11th, and all these different...
Yes, maybe I can answer for that. The idea in the film is actually to bring reflections of our theme in media which is accessible to us, which is online. This is the first stage of the project, and it's an experiment. And so, that's a kind of like a projection of what you find online on that subject. And there are all kind of notions of the way modernity is, the way it's being accepted in different areas, different places. And what we did here is actually kind of associative narrative, which brings up, like, for example, this image was created as glorifying modernity, but when we look at it now, and also in the way it's edited and with the sound, it has a bit of irony in it. I think modernity in one stage was very pretentious, of saving the world, enlightenment, and then when we show the impact of the shock of modernity, you see other, other impacts coming from that. So, I hope that answers your question a little bit.
I'll add something, because I think I understood the question slightly differently, because for me, we're not talking about modernity in the sense that we don't have to explain to you what modernity is.
Okay.
You can read Habermas, read Kalinesko, a lot of good authors. What's more interesting for us is trying to reframe the ideas of some of the conflicts taking place today, about how, regarding nation states, homogeneous nation states, all of these kind of things, which are framed in our media in different ways. reframe them and trying to point out that we are talking about bigger processes involved here, and to try and kind of attach them to or integrate them into other kind of storylines and frameworks is incorrect. So that's basically where we would like to go here. And again, also to emphasize that it's not kind of modernity against tradition, because again, a lot of those who pose as defenders of tradition are already modern in many ways. I mean, if we stay a little bit still in that world of the issues of Afghanistan and things, and we see the Pakistani Taliban, one thing they're doing, there's a kind of anger among a lot of youth in Pakistan against their own hierarchy. So they are being mobilized also against the social, the kind of tribal elders and kind of traditional structures which have been there for a long time. So we're talking about a more radical movement instead of a revolutionary movement, which is by nature very modern, even while it claims to be looking back in time. And again, I think for maybe us working, a lot of us in the culture field, the Romantics are always a good example.